AI is really now at the forefront of national security worries as well as economic worries. And I think what you can see, and why it's great to be on this podcast, is kind of national security and economics and business increasingly merging.
Yes.
It's something we've seen in the last 5-10 years. You know, they used to be kind of separate and would only occasionally kind of meet each other. Whereas these days, especially over China, it's becoming kind of more and more intertwined, those two subjects. And the race over AI is perhaps, you know, the kind of best example of that.
I am delighted to say one of my former colleagues from the BBC, Gordon Carrera, is with us. Security correspondent, of course, covering all kinds of topics like terrorism, cybersecurity, spying, all of that. And now the host of The Rest is Classified with David McCloskey.
And I know, I've joined the Rest is family, so it's great to be part of it.
And it's fascinating, your podcast, because you really go into all those kind of conspiracies we love to talk about.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's loads I want to get into with you, particularly what's going on with China. It's something that Robert and I are talking about all the time at the moment in terms of investment and spying, the tariffs with Trump. There's loads to get into. Before that, though, I want to take you on a trip down memory lane.
Okay.
Because this was a long time ago now. It was about, God, it must have been about 15 years ago. And I rang you for your help on something because at the time I was Robert's producer. I was in my 20s. I'd been on a night out in Soho.
Oh, yeah.
And I'd, yeah, I like that. Oh, yeah. And I'd had my mobile nicked, right?
Yeah.
Nightmare, but didn't think much of it. It was a flip phone. It was an old Nokia flip phone. Anyway, a couple of days later, I'm with my mum and dad, and dad's phone rang, and then my mum's phone rang. He didn't get to it in time because parents seemingly never do manage that. And I was like, someone's ringing your phone. This is weird because it's normally only me who rings your mobile phone, particularly back then. Mum answered it. Suddenly heard her going, yes, okay, yes, I'm with my daughter. That's my daughter, blah, blah, blah. And I was thinking, what is going on? She hands me the phone and it is a police officer who is, he tells me, from the counter-terrorism unit. And he's saying to me, I need to ask you some questions about your phone. And I was like, my phone, yeah, it got stolen. And he said, you've got pictures of the BBC on your phone? And I was like, yeah, I work there. And you could hear a bit of relief in his voice when I said that. And then he said, okay, and I'm like, hang on a minute, who are you? Like, you're on my mum's mobile. Yeah. This is a scam. And instantly my financial scam dog is going off in my head. Anyway, it turns out it is supposedly from the counterterrorism unit. This guy tells me that he's rang mum and dad in my phone, because if it was a terrorist phone, that might be like the code name for someone important. I mean, it does sound really far-fetched. And I came off the phone and I was like, this is rubbish. This is total rubbish. I don't get this. Because they wouldn't give me any of their details.
Yeah,
they just said,
it's counter-terrorism. They're very secret about it. Yeah.
Someone will be in touch in a couple of days. And I was like, nah, I'm not having it. So I went to the local police station and went in and said, this has happened. And they said, oh, yeah, that does sound a bit unusual. Then they went off into the back room and came back and said, no, we can't get involved in this. Just wait until you're contacted. Well, suddenly I felt like I was in a James Bond movie. Because it's like, what has gone on? And I did get contacted again. And this person on the phone tells me, we have reason to believe that a suspected terrorist has tried to board a flight at Heathrow and they had your phone on them. And so, and we need you to come to the station to give a statement. And I'm like, what do you want me to say in the statement?
Yeah, what do I know? Yeah.
They said, can you come and meet us? And actually, maybe if we meet rather than at the police station, if you could meet us in this pub, it'd be a bit more relaxed. And I'm like, again, my little spidey senses are going, this is dodgy as. At that point, Robert Peston says to me, why don't you ring Frank Gardner or Gordon Carrera and, securities correspondents and ask them what to do? I rang you. I think you thought I was a bit mad.
No.
Yeah, and you said to me, go, take as many, this is really interesting, take as many notes as you can.
Yeah.
So again, my journalist was like, right, I'll take my mate with me. And then got to the station because I'd said I'm not meeting at a pub, like that just feels really like weird. And then they said, oh no, we were just trying to make it easier for you so you didn't have the kind of intimidation of coming into a station and all that. I wasn't sure about that. Anyway, went to the station, gave this statement, was all excited to find out what the rest of the story was. And it was just, that was it. They
They never told you any more.
No.
So that's very interesting. So firstly, I think it feels like we should be doing an episode of The Rest is Classified, investigating
what happened
the
to my
story
phone.
of that mobile phone and what the mystery of what happened to it.
Yeah.
Because it does sound strange. I mean, I guess maybe it was useful for them to be able to get that crime report from you to hold the guy, because often they have suspects and they need to investigate them and they don't know what they can charge them with or if there's something they can charge them with. So if they had that, then you know that might have helped them. But it does make you wonder. I mean, sometimes there's an overlap between criminality and terrorism. So he might have had a load of stolen phones stolen phones and be shipping them and using that to fund terrorism. You sometimes used to see stuff like that. But yeah, it's a good mystery.
Anyway, we're not here to talk about
your phone. Well, we can do.
So obviously everyone's talking about China at the minute, and it's really fascinating. I mean, it's coincidental. It's Chinese New Year. It's the year of the snake, isn't it? And I think that it's really interesting, particularly in the last couple of days. DeepSeek.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot on this show about NVIDIA, the kind of, this business that's brought out these AI processing chips. It's absolutely stormed the market. There was no beating them, or so it seemed, in everything we use. Obviously really important for AI, absolutely flying on the stock market. And then DeepSeek, this little company no one's really been talking about, apart from Peston will be screaming if he's listening to this. I've been going on about them for ages. They come out and they've developed something to rival ChatGPT that is using fewer NVIDIA chips. And therefore, NVIDIA's stock tanks
by $588 billion in a day. I mean, that's like the amount of money to lose in a day. It's kind of tells you something big's going on.
Yeah. But now there's a kind of talk of they've done this via industrial espionage.
Yeah.
There's what are they going to do with this?
Yeah.
What go on, give us your
no, and
flavour.
you're right. There's some questions about espionage, but there's also some questions about how did they actually do it? There's still some mysteries around it. But there's no doubt this is a shock to the US. And it's a shock because AI is really now at the forefront of national security worries as well as economic worries. And I think what you can see, and why it's great to be on this podcast, is kind of national security and economics and business increasingly merging.
Yes.
It's something we've seen in the last 5-10 years. They used to be kind of separate and would only occasionally kind of meet each other. Whereas these days, especially over China, it's becoming kind of more and more intertwined, those two subjects. And the race over AI is perhaps, the kind of best example of that. There are other examples as well, but AI is a big one because, whoever gets there first, whoever gets there fastest, they get massive economic advantages, might be able to kind of keep that first mover advantage and lock it in, but they also get kind of national security advantages to it as well. And economic power is security power, but also there's specific ways in which it feeds into national security, the things you can do with AI in the military domain, in the cyber domain, in terms of influence operations. All these things mean AI is at the kind of forefront between that kind of rivalry between the US and China. And I think, people have talked about DeepSeek being a kind of Sputnik moment, the reference being to when the Soviet Union launched that first satellite into space. And the US had thought in the Cold War it was ahead in technology, and suddenly it goes, hang on, we're not. Now, I'm not sure it's quite, the same as that, but it's close, I think. The kind of shock that the US had thought it was ahead. It was convinced that its restrictions on chips going to China had made a difference. And it was convinced, it had the science, the innovation to keep it ahead. So suddenly this idea that it may not be, and, how far that's true, still a bit early days, I think is a shock to the security establishment, as well as the business establishment that really matters.
It's really interesting timing as well, of course, isn't it? Because obviously Trump's just back in. Do you think that there's a reason this has happened now, as in they were waiting for Trump to come back in, for him to, whack on again, you're coming back with 60% tariffs or whatever, and they've had this ready to go, and they're like, look, we can bring down, your top companies.
We're in the race with you. Yeah, not really clear if because it's not really clear how far DeepSeek are kind of how close they are to the state. And that's always a question with Chinese companies.
Yes, true. That's a good point.
And they've actually been a bit more below the radar than some of the other big Chinese companies, who are more closely associated. So I think that's hard to say. Definitely a kind of big questions about the Biden administration policy. I think this issue of chips is the big one, because that's, with NVIDIA, what it comes down to is the idea that the US thought it had restricted some of the high-end chips going to China, and that would slow down their AI development. Instead, China has shown it can innovate, it can use open source, maybe it can use some US research and, piggyback off that. That's one of the big questions. And that maybe it's found ways to get around those restrictions. It's stockpiled some of those chips early. Maybe it's found other ways to get hold of some of the chips. So there's a kind of policy question for the US and for the Trump administration, which is, can you restrict China? Or by restricting it, are you just pushing it to innovate faster in new ways?
Yeah.
How is the Trump administration going to play that race? The Biden administration have one plan. And I think a lot of people think, well, what Trump might do, because he's close to all the tech bros, as they call them, the tech bros, the kind of Elon Musk of this world. It sounds so like
fraternity,
It
doesn't
does, and I think it is a little bit, all bros. He might go, okay, we need to beat China. That would be the Trump way.
Yeah.
Unleash them, go for it. And I think, one of the interesting things that some people worry about is that the kind of race between the US and China will lead to a kind of no interest in regulation from the US administration, because they just want to beat China.
Yeah.
So they'll just say, go for it, do whatever you want, not much worry about safety of AI development or anything else, because all the emphasis will be on the national security priority of beating China. And I think, there's a lot to look at there for how DeepSeek is going to kind of play out with that debate in Washington, and what it will mean for kind of not just what kind of AI, but how much regulation there is out of it from the Trump administration.
Yeah, and that's when that kind of race, as you say, with not much regulation could mean AI could easily be used for bad.
Yeah, and I think, these open source models, and DeepSeek is an open source model, which means the code is available to other people to use. You can, use it to make your own applications and things like that. The worry is that has big national security implications, because the potential is other states can use it, criminals can use it, people can use it to develop biological research, to develop drugs, but you could also use it for biological research to develop weapons. So, there are really big questions about the kind of unleashing of that AI without regulation, or with what kind of regulation. Yeah.
And then at the same time, you've got everything kicking off with TikTok as well. And I know this is something you guys did a whole episode on. It was fascinating to hear that. You should watch it. Watch and listen. You can watch and listen.
You can do both, yeah.
The weird thing about this podcast land now. But yeah, it's a brilliant episode. You should definitely listen to that. So I'm really interested in this because obviously TikTok, as your co-host David talks about, he watches hippo videos and things like that, doesn't he, amongst other things. I loved hearing that. I was like, he's like a former CIA agent, like turned spy novelist who watches hippo videos on TikTok.
I mean, we all have to relax somehow, but that's clearly his way, not mine, I'm afraid.
It's interesting this because obviously Trump hated it to begin with, didn't he? And then Biden came in and has ended up banning it, which only lasted for a couple of days before Trump came in and reversed that. And it's something massively used in America, isn't it? I think you guys said it's like a third of adults in America use it now.
It's amazing, for news and information. Yeah.
Yes, but obviously the concern is around the fact that TikTok is owned by ByteDance, which is a Chinese company. What is the big issue with TikTok here? For those people who are listening to this, who are like, whether they or their kids use TikTok and they're doing daft videos and everything else, what's the fascination with it?
Should they worry about it?
Yeah.
And it is interesting because before DeepSeek, TikTok, just a couple of weeks ago was the kind of national security worry when it came to China. It just shows you how quickly things move. So TikTok, I think, is really interesting because, there is this kind of simple question people ask, which is TikTok spying on you? It's not really, it's actually a lot more complicated, I think, the threat. And it goes again to the bigger questions about the US and China and security and business, because there are a couple of layers to it. One is TikTok collecting data? Does it collect your personal data? And the answer is yes. But also in the way that lots of other apps, social media apps
does as well.
So does Facebook, so does Instagram, so does, X, Twitter. That's their business model, is to collect data on you to sell it as advertising, as we know. One of the issues about TikTok is, though, that should we care about that data going to China? Now, most people will not be worried about when they're watching their hippo videos rather than hip-hop videos.
Or hippos doing hip-hop.
Maybe. But they won't worry about that. Do you care? And for the average person, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Although in the aggregate, all of that data going to a Chinese company is quite valuable for the insights you can use to mine it about people. About behavior, about social behavior, to train your AI on that kind of data, going back to AI. So there's value in that data beyond it being used to spy on you individually. But as I said, that may also be true for, other companies as well.
Yeah.
But it's the issue of the nationality of the companies. Do you trust Chinese companies? And China, has a national intelligence law which says Chinese companies have to give data to the state if they demand it. Now, TikTok is very clear. It won't do that. It keeps its data outside of China, keeps it in the US, keeps it in Singapore if it's American, different for different countries. So, they deny that there's any risk to data, but there is that kind of data risk. I think the more interesting and the bigger question with TikTok is actually to do with the fact that it's become the primary source of news and information for people.
Yes.
The fact it has a very powerful algorithm, which recommends people more information. And that's what makes it so good. That's its secret sauce, is that algorithm, which drives people to more content, which is useful and which they find engaging. And the question is, could that be used to shape people's views?
Yeah.
Could you use it to restrict what information people see? And, in our podcast, David was talking about this idea of cognitive warfare.
Yes, fascinating.
Sounds quite dramatic, doesn't it? And it sounds
but
like...
it explains it.
But yeah, it's basically, you don't necessarily just fight wars with armies. You can fight it in people's minds.
Yeah.
You can imagine situations in which you could sow more division in a country that you were, trying to disrupt. Or you could restrict the ability of another country, let's say, to know things about Taiwan or Tibet or issues which are sensitive to China, or to push certain narratives or viewpoints through what's effectively a secret algorithm. Now, TikTok, we should say, absolutely denies it does this, and there's no evidence at the moment that it does. It's the potential. And I think that's one of the things that worries people, is that as people become more dependent on TikTok as their primary source of news and information, which it is for a lot of people in America, particularly younger people, the ability to use that to shape their views and understanding of the world is pretty powerful. Now, you could say Meta, Facebook, Instagram can do that as well. And you can see them tweaking their algorithms to turn what content people can see. They're limiting the fact check, allowing more misinformation to go up, part of what they say is free speech. So you can see it's possible for that algorithm to be manipulated to change what people see. Again, the issue is, how comfortable are people being dependent on a company which is linked to China for the bulk of their news and information? What are the implications of that when there is a rivalry, an adversity, and potentially even a conflict between the US and China? That's the question.
Yeah, because obviously we saw around the elections and things in various countries that there was a lot of debate about how much people were influencing their voting by what they saw on
by
social
TikTok,
media.
And there's some European elections. I think, was it Romania? There's been a few where people have said, TikTok played a really powerful role. Now, that was people using TikTok.
Yeah.
But the sense that it has that power, is real. So again, it's a question of dependency. And I think this is the really sensitive thing for the US, which has been so used to having the lead in technology companies, for its social media giants to be the ones the rest of the world is using. To suddenly be dependent on China is difficult. And remember, one of the interesting facts is that Western US social media companies are not allowed in China. So China, China won't let Facebook, Instagram, X operate in China, but TikTok is operating in the West. And so you can see
but
why.
But not in China, which is
and they have a different version in China with slightly different algorithms. Yeah. So you look at that and you can see why, if people are looking at it from a national security point of view, they're like, is this a dependency that we're comfortable with, or is this a national security threat? It's more complicated than spying, if you like. It's not really about spying. It's more about risk and potential of what could happen.
Yeah, you guys describe it. It was really amazingly put. It's a weapon. It potentially could be a weapons delivery system in a cognitive AI battle.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's when you think of it like that, you suddenly go, I mean, it made me suddenly question what I am looking at online. You do, don't you? Can we talk about then the kind of form and why we're so worried about China? Because obviously the other big story was around Huawei and what they were doing in terms of using tech to somehow be spying on us and things like that. And everybody went crazy about that, didn't they? And there was loads of time and money spent on taking the products apart.
And I mean, it was for the UK was really caught in the middle between the US and China on that. And I think it's a really good case study for some of the questions that come up, with Chinese investment and as Chinese technology companies get bigger. And, the thing about Huawei is it was the first Chinese company to go global, and where other countries were suddenly finding themselves using Huawei kit, becoming potentially dependent on it again in a very sensitive area, which is telecoms. And again, it wasn't that there was evidence that Huawei was spying or that there were backdoors. It was the potential for it. It was about the dependency, the possibility that the data could be going to China and that it would be hard to spot. And that potentially if your entire telecoms infrastructure through which you rely on, everything else runs off your telecoms infrastructure, for data and for connectivity, if that is in Chinese hands, does that make you dependent on China and then able to exert influence over you because they could switch you off? And it was really interesting because I covered it in a lot of depth at the time, and Britain thought it had found a middle way. And I think this is what's really interesting. The UK thought it had found a middle way where we had Huawei in our telecoms infrastructure. Long story how it came in. It was a deal with BT who thought it was cheaper, and it was cheaper. And then they suddenly went, there are some security risks to this. Yeah. And then they then had to retrofit some security around it. And Britain then put a kind of wrapper around Huawei, where they had a fascinating place in Banbury, which I went to, where they inspected the Huawei kit to look for secret backdoors, the code, but also the physical routers and devices and switches. And Britain thought, right, we've got a position where we've got it in our infrastructure, but we can inspect it, we can be comfortable with it. This is a way of dealing with the risks of globalization and of Chinese investment and having the cheaper kit, but not having the security risks. And the US came along and said, basically, we are not happy with you having that. We are not happy with one of our closest allies having that Chinese kit in the system. We want it out. And they squeezed the UK hard. And, they took various measures. They made various threats. They cut off, again, chip supply to Huawei, which then, made it harder for the UK to assess its security. The US dialed it up. And in the end, the UK had to basically fold and go in with its ally in the US. And that was an example where if you have got growing US-China tension, it is hard to be in the middle.
Yes.
And I think, this is a big question for this government, which is currently looking for investment from China. Yeah. Rachel Reeves going to Beijing. Now, which areas, it may not be in nuclear and telecoms and some of the more sensitive areas. So it's different for different areas. But you've got that drive from the government. If you've also got a Trump administration which wants to turn up the dial on China, then you can see that those tensions that were there over Huawei, they could come back again, over different industries and over different questions.
Do you know, it's got very traitors vibes, this, isn't it? It's like trying to work out who's the faithful and who's the traitor out of all of these different Chinese companies. We had Jared Lyons on the show a few weeks ago, obviously economist on the board of the Bank of China, very big into talking about the positives that could come from investment from Chinese companies into the UK. And obviously, we haven't got any money. We keep talking about this big black hole. We need better infrastructure. We need investment and all of that jazz. And as you say, Rachel Reeves is doing the rounds at the minute, trying to drum up that. Are you worried about what they might invest in? Now, we're talking about Heathrow at the moment, and the Chinese have a stake in Heathrow.
Yeah.
I know they've rowed back a bit. We've talked about that on another episode about pulling back on some of the areas you've said, like nuclear and telecoms and things. But what are your thoughts on it?
Well, I think even the most hawkish people would say security worries should not stop you dealing with China. And one of the things, the Biden administration was hawkish on China, but was still sending the Commerce Secretary out to China to do the business. So, the US, we shouldn't think that actually worrying about security means you shouldn't do business with China. It just means being discerning, I think, about where. And I think that's the difficult issue, is trying to work out where are the areas where you'd worry about being dependent on China, where they might have a kind of influence or coercive control. Where are the areas where it's sensitive national security technology? And in the old days, that was simple because you just go, it's the defense industry. But now, it's not anymore, because security and business are merging, and it's anywhere with data.
Yeah.
And with large amounts of personal data or business data, how sensitive should we be about that? So that's, I think there's a new category of businesses where in the old days, as I said, defence and critical industries, you'd go, let's keep foreign or adversarial ownership out of that. But which ones are critical? Where data, and it's often not ones which look critical, which hold large amounts of data, which could be useful to China.
Yes.
And how should we feel about that? So I think rethinking where those boundaries lie and going anything outside of those kind of sensitive areas, they shouldn't, no one should think there's a problem with that. I think there's also kind of question about whether it's good for us to kind of disentangle ourselves, the West, from China, or whether that actually raises the risks of conflict. Because a lot of people would say, some people who are in favour of engagement, and I've heard George Osborne say this, for instance, that actually you want to have both sides having skin in the game of, our economies being, if you like, entangled, because then it makes it less likely that there'll be a conflict.
Yes, because they're relying on you.
Because
They don't want you to tank. Yeah.
Neither side wants the other to tank. But other people say, well, if you look back at history, the economy was very globalised before the First World War, and it didn't stop countries going to war. Business and economic reasons don't always trump nationalism and security.
It's so interesting, though, as you've explained, that kind of how you work out what's sensitive and what isn't. So, like, we did a series about children's homes being owned privately, and there's a lot of kind of, for example, Saudi money in children's homes here, and even like in the northeast there's a lot of Saudi money in the football club and the chemicals industry and things like that, and it's like looking at the lesser of evils in some way and then you think, well, what's sensitive and what isn't, and for example, the money spent by local councils on things like children's home, and that's totally killed our public finances and things like that. I don't know how you work out what's useful foreign money and what isn't. And where, because essentially everyone is trying to profit from us, aren't they? They're not doing it out of the good of their hearts.
And sometimes it's just profit.
Yes.
and that can have problems.
Power.
And sometimes it's power and influence.
Yeah.
Or
whitewashing.
Or reputation washing or things like that. And you see that a lot with countries and companies sometimes doing that. So I guess it's just being alert to that. And I think, the problem is the more desperate the economic situation in the UK looks, the more likely you are to turn a blind eye to it. But then there are risks down the road to that. And I think, it's really difficult, because I think if all you did was listen to security hawks in government or in the spy services, then you wouldn't have economic growth and you'd have all kinds of other problems. So there's, I think one of the challenges for government is how you think about these things together. Where in government, how in business, how people kind of mix those, have an understanding of where they meet and mix. And I think that's different from where it used to be in the past, where I think, as I said, there was kind of separate worlds, security and business.
Do you think there's any chance that, I don't know, the Chinese government are just laughing at everyone at the minute, going, everyone thinks we're trying to do all these sneaky things. We're not bothered. We're just making money out of you, and we're just doing what's best for our country. And they're
worried about they're worried about their own economic growth. Yeah. And that's the thing. So what's different about them is they have long range plans.
Yeah.
They have long range plans, and they've had made in China projects in which they've said, here are the technologies and the industries we will strategically invest in and aim to have leadership on. AI is one of them, but so is, for instance, green technology. And they've been very strategic about it over years. We will have leadership in building turbines, in solar panels, in these areas. Now, if you go back 10, 20 years, there were British companies and, American companies and others who'd say, well, we had some of our technology ripped off.
Yes.
And then China built them cheaper and then took over the market, and we're out, and now we're dependent on them. But whatever the ways in which it happened, the result of that very strategic plan by China has been to lead in certain technologies. And I think, that's partly about economic growth. It's partly, actually, if you go to China, it's about their fear of being dependent on Western technology. Something we don't often talk about is that they fear, it's why they don't have Western social media companies there. They fear that the West will use it to spy on them, or the West, that they don't want to be dependent on Western technology. So you can see from their point of view as well, they're kind of nervous about it and thinking, we want to be sovereign, we want to be independent, and we want to be global leaders in these areas. And I think, whether it's AI, whether it's some other fields, we're going to see a great test of these models, whether the kind of China strategic state-run, state-led model versus a kind of American let the private sector rip and compete model. On AI and on some other fields, we're going to see something quite interesting, which is which ones which one's actually going to do better.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I used to work for a manufacturer up in the northeast when I was starting out. I was training to be an engineer, and recently bumped into one of the lads I work with there who now runs factories out in China. So, because obviously a lot of the manufacturing went out to the east, and he was saying now they obviously have been trying to get around the Trump tariffs, so they've been doing things via like Taiwan and places like that. But also he was saying they're physically moving factories out of cities to really remote places as well, because they're so worried that if the war or whatever does happen, they don't want to lose all these factories they've got, and they're moving them out to really random places. So he said he's been taken out in these, on these trips where he will see incredible military operations, and that's where they're going to put these really key factories for the manufacturing sector. It's so fascinating.
That is fascinating.
Yeah. And he was like, I don't know what's going to happen next. It just feels like, we get, you would think his job as running factories, it would be just a very simple business operation. And he said it's so much more than that in China, because it is about security all the time as well.
And politics,
yes,
navigating your relationship with the Communist Party and all those kind of things. Yeah, I mean, business is different in China, I think, and I think Western businesses, increasingly have found it hard to operate there and have moved out. So, yeah, I mean, I think that, whether we're going to kind of disentangle, and what that means, but at the same time, we're looking for more investment, it's going to be hard.
Yeah, it's hard to get that balance.
It's hard to get that balance.
So in summary then, because we've talked about laws there, haven't we?
You have, yeah.
What should we be looking out for next? Like, what has got you kind of going at the minute in terms of...
I think on the tech race, I think just watch closely for whether what we've seen with DeepSeek is a kind of really just a kind of brief a burst of kind of fear from the US side about what it means, or if it's a big realignment. Because if so, if it really challenges the model that they built for the tech companies and how they were going to grow, and if they really think China is actually catching up potentially much faster than they thought, that is going to be a really, really big national security issue as well as a business issue for the United States. And I think a lot of other things will then flow from that. And, the competition could get pretty fierce. I think when it comes to the US and China, you just cannot predict with the Trump administration whether they are going to, Trump is going to dial up the tariff threat and do a deal, or whether actually we're heading for a period of real tension, which I think could have really serious economic implications, including for the UK.
Yeah, which is very scary, isn't it? Right, we should probably wrap things up there. We've been talking for ages.
Oh, we have, but I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, and obviously do listen to The Rest is Classified. It's brilliant. How many episodes in are you now? You're about 15
a couple of months. Yeah, we've done a couple of months. Still feeling quite new, but we're enjoying it enormously. So,
excellent. And tell us about some of the topics you've covered that people can listen to.
We've covered an emergency one on TikTok recently. We've done Russian spies in New York and London, including infiltrating Manhattan high life.
Yeah.
So we're having a look at that. If you're interested in Russian influence, we're going to be looking at a bit more kind of cyber espionage. We've done North Korean cyber spies. We'll be looking at, hackers and things like that. So, a lot of interesting topics to come.
I love how you were telling me that with the eyes of like, woo.
I can tell you something, but not everything.